Mr. Speaker, the very first speech that I made on this floor, the floor of the House of Representatives, in January of 2007, was precisely about securing the border. In some areas, border security has improved over time, and in many ways it has worsened. I've been proud to support legislation and appropriations that funded the Border Patrol and Department of Homeland Security, including ICE as well, for increases in personnel and technology. Democrats and Republicans have worked together to give the Department of Homeland Security the resources they need, and we have seen those resources in the Tucson sector. I have fought to increase funding for local law enforcement programs through the State Criminal Alien Assistance Program, also known as SCAP. When the President budget eliminated SCAP, I led the fight to restore the funding. And why this is important is that communities out in Cochise County and Santa Cruz County, Pinal County as well, Santa Cruz County, Pima County, they carry the brunt of this problem because the local law enforcement agents are oftentimes required to respond when a resident calls in need of help. They're responsible for a lot of the work that should be done by the federal government. If the federal government has very increasingly not been able or been not willing to reimburse the local law enforcement agents for the costs that they incurred. We were able to augment the budget. Proud of that. I also worked to establish Operation Streamline. It's a program that finally reversed the many years of the catch and release situation that we had down in southern Arizona. So instead of just apprehending illegal immigrants and then immediately deporting back to the border to find them crossing over the next day, back and forth, we are now in a situation that instead we charge these individuals and we incarcerate illegal immigrants for 30 days, which is a big deterrent for someone who's trying to pass north. Last year, and again this year, I introduced legislation with Congressman Sam Johnson from Texas to create a new mandatory electronic employment verification system for hiring employees. Our system would be a national employee verification system that would protect American citizens from identity theft and hold employers accountable for hiring illegal immigrants. The state of Arizona was the first state to authorize E-Verify, making it mandatory for all employers. But we've seen a lot of problems with E-Verify, plus the fact that this situation of employee verification should not be a state-by-state situation. We need to have a national solution, and that's why Congressman Sam Johnson and I have introduced legislation, NEVA. Recently, with Congressman Brian Bilbray, I introduced a bill to crack down the use of stored value cards, which drug cartels are using increasingly to launder money. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I have an example right here. This is an example of a stored value card that you can buy basically at any retailer. These stored value cards do not require any formal banking agreement. The threat assessment by the U.S. Department of Justice, the National Drug Intelligence Center, dubbed the cards an ideal money laundering instrument, citing loose regulation, cardholder anonymity, and liberal limits on value, reloading, withdrawal, and spending on certain types of these cards. And again, you can go to a store and anyone can buy these stored values cards. We're also seeing increasingly more stored value devices like cell phones, where money can be transferred hundreds of millions of dollars through these types of devices. According to a March 7, 2010 article in the Arizona Daily Star, of the 415 seizures on the southwest border in 2009 was $89,565, more than double the average seizure 5 years ago. That is why this legislation, the Stored Value Device Registration and Reporting Act of 2010, is so important. This is legislation that will include the stored value devices, either the cards or the cell phones, under the definition of a monetary instrument under Title 31 in the United States Code. This will require cardholders to declare if they're carrying $10,000 on a stored value device to customs officers. Because currently the federal officials have absolutely no way of tracking whether or not this money is coming into the United States because individuals are not required to declare whether or not they have money on a stored value device. Mr. Speaker, at 6:20 early Sunday morning 2 weeks ago, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, also known as NORAD, detected a low, small flying aircraft in southern Arizona near the border with Mexico. NORAD immediately scrambled 2 F-16s to intercept the ultralight aircraft, shadowing it for 30 minutes until that small plane returned to Mexico. This is just another example of how the drug smugglers are getting ahead of us. By using these small homemade planes, they stealthily enter our country illegally. Right before that, Congressman Dean Heller and I introduced another bill that will dramatically increase the penalties for the newest way to smuggle drugs, flying them in by ultralight aircraft. These single-pilot aircraft are capable of flying low and can land and take off quickly. They're very difficult to detect. We have reports of them flying up to 200 miles into our country from Mexico. They're being used to bring drugs into our communities and represents the latest threat to border security. And if they can bring in drugs, they can also bring in other materials that will threaten our national security. I first learned about the illicit use of ultralights in a briefing by the United States Border Patrol. They told me that we needed to take action to crack down on the ultralight drug smugglers. And that's why I introduced the Ultralight Smuggling Prevention Act. Ultralights are typically used by people for sport or for recreation, and as a result are currently not categorized as an aircraft by the Federal Aviation Administration. In the 2010 National Drug Assessment released by the National Drug Intelligence Center, they identified ultralights as one of the newest ways that drug cartels are using to smuggle drugs into our country. And according to the CBP Air and Marine Operations Center, or the AMOC, based in Riverside, California, there were 193 suspected incursions into our country, and 135, make that 136 with the incursion 2 weeks ago, by ultralights from October 1st to the present time. In October of 2008, AMOC detected an unidentified northbound low-flying aircraft 12 miles west of Nogales. A CBP surveillance helicopter was launched from Tucson, and the low-flying aircraft was identified as an ultralight. The pilot landed southwest of Marana, Arizona, with 223 pounds of marijuana on board, where Border Patrol was waiting to transport the pilot and the marijuana to another location. In November of 2008, near San Luis, field workers arrived for work and discovered a crashed ultralight, a dead pilot, and 141 pounds of marijuana. And in December of 2008, the pilot of an ultralight collided with power lines and crashed southwest of Tucson. The pilot had been carrying, this time, 350 pounds of marijuana when he crashed. It's time for the federal government to get ahead of the drug traffickers. We need to pass this legislation to outmaneuver these individuals who are trying to bring drugs into our country and to do us harm. And the Ultralight Smuggling Prevention Act will amend the Tariff Act of 1930 to include ultralight aircraft under aviation smuggling provisions. There is an unintended loophole that needs to be closed. We have to give law enforcement the tools that they need to crack down on the drug smugglers. And because ultralights are not currently technically considered aircraft, they do not fall under the smuggling provision. So under my legislation, individuals caught smuggling on ultralights can be prosecuted for using the aircraft, in addition to being prosecuted for the drugs in their possession. When they are convicted of this new offense, they can receive a maximum penalty of up to 20 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. The bill will establish the same penalties for smuggling drugs on ultralights as for smuggling on airplanes and in automobiles.